It's an almost unspeakable feeling to be in a room that's such a celebratory nature and hear the man behind me talk about deporting more people than President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1954, an operation with a name so racist that it's not appropriate to say on television. He's talking about removing more than 10 million people from this country who have been here, many of them since they were little children, contribute to this society, contribute to this economy, live in all of our neighborhoods and communities. And now we're throwing balloons around as if this is a party. He talked about the Democrats, again, cheating. Cheat was the word he used in the last election, after saying he was here to unify the nation. And it's a bizarre feeling that I'm not sure I'm able to fully articulate right now. They're painting it as a party, but it is a deeply divisive message. Any way you want to look at it, you can put the unity bumper sticker all over it. But what we heard tonight was not a message of bringing people together. It was a message of literally kicking millions of people out of the country.
Jacob, I'm obsessed with talking about immigration right now. I think it is such a dynamic conversation because of what we're seeing with the Trump administration, but also how Democrats are going to end up tackling this. You've been covering immigration here at NBC News and MSNBC now for, what, 8 years, 9 years, 10 years?
Yeah.
We've been talking about it a lot. We were down in Florida and some other places
At
where
Homestead,
those
where they were
detention
sheltering
centers were.
the separated kids.
During the child separations, you wrote a great book about it. You've been covering it the past 20 days, remarkably, from Los Angeles. And I thought it was important to go back to that moment on the convention floor because we're hearing so many people say that they're surprised. By how Donald Trump is going after this. I'm surprised that they're detaining my next door neighbor. I'm surprised they're getting the guy who's caring for my lawn, or the lady that works at my local diner. I'm surprised by it. I thought he was going to go after criminals. That's not what they said on the convention. At the convention, that's not what they were promising.
This is exactly what they promised that they would do. And occasionally they would say, we're going to go after the worst of the worst first, which they haven't even done. But they promised a mass deportation plan modeled after, as you played in that clip, the Dwight D. Eisenhower 1954
Which, by the way, is
operation.
not new. I mean, he was talking about doing this during the 2016 campaign.
Right.
And they were saying that Eisenhower did it first, we're going to do it better. They were not able to do it the first administration, and this was a promise that he felt he needed to keep, in his words, this time around.
The model for this was deporting 1 million Mexicans, and I can't emphasize it enough, Mexican Americans as well. They deported many Mexican Americans as well. Eisenhower did. And that's the program that Stephen Miller chose to be the model for Donald Trump's mass deportation program, which they signified by, they weren't in that clip, but thousands of people holding up signs inside a sports arena that said mass deportation now. This is always what they said they were going to do. In fact, as you point out rightly, in the first term, when Stephen Miller led the family separation program, which was considered, as we all know, under the Obama administration and rejected, he wanted to separate tens of thousands of kids using administrative separations, and instead was stopped at 5,500 by the judge, Dana Sabraw in the Southern District of California, by the Pope, by protesters all around the world, and by pushback. Donald Trump, when he stopped the policy, I just want to say, said he didn't stop it because he said, oh, I'm morally opposed to what's happening. I realized how painful this is on families. He said, I didn't like the sight and the feeling of the families being separated when Ginger Thompson at ProPublica released that audio of the kids crying and the Border Patrol agents saying, oh, we have an orchestra here. It made people realize what was going on. And I think we're getting close to that moment after 20 days of everyday raids in Los Angeles and videos showing up on a daily basis of what these tactics actually look like.
Do you think so?
Look at who they're taking. They're taking a gardener, Narciso Barranco, who has 3 U.S. Marine sons. They're showing up at Home Depot and taking day laborers. They're showing up to Oxnard and Camarillo and flying over strawberry fields with Black Hawk helicopters, chasing people through the fields because they couldn't get into packing plants for the fruits and vegetables because they didn't show up, I suppose, with a warrant. They're going after the, no pun intended, the lowest hanging fruit. People on the streets, at car washes, they're showing up at.
Do you think that they actually like these images? Because with the family separations, part of it, and you said this so brilliantly during the time and in your documentary or in your movie Separated, that you were being used as a way for the administration to deter immigrants from coming across the border. Having reporters go and see what it was like in those detention centers, those separated children, would make people who were thinking about crossing the border think again.
I'm not here to be, first of all, to get in the heads of Donald Trump or his administration. I'm not here to be a foil for Donald Trump's administration or an adversary. I'm here to report the facts that I see. And what I see is, if they like it so much, why is Tricia McLaughlin, the spokesperson for the Department of Homeland Security, responding to my reporting on social media, talking about how he assaulted Narciso Barranco agents with a weed whacker when the video doesn't show that? Why does CBP write back to me and put up additional videos in slow motion shot by their own documentary crew to make it look dramatic of him moving the weed whacker, the tool, towards the agents as he runs away? I'm not saying that didn't get hairy. And I'm not saying that he didn't, as his son told me on Deadline White House, that he didn't have a human reaction and try to do whatever he could to not get captured by these guys.
It's masked agents coming and taking you off the street. And I think anyone's first instinct would be, who is this? Where am I going? Are these police officers? Is it law enforcement, or is it somebody else?
Well, just another example. The day after, and I'm not saying it has anything to do with our reporting, other people were there too. The day after I was in the fields reporting on this very network for from the strawberry fields, Donald Trump decided that they weren't going to raid farms anymore. And then
that was Brooke Rollins, his ag secretary, coming and saying they're getting a lot of pushback from business owners, from farmers, saying you're making it a problem for us.
And I'm not inside those rooms, so I don't know why ultimately he flip-flopped back again to say, no, we can't do that.
Well, the reporting is that it was Stephen Miller.
But what I can tell you is they're watching very closely, obviously, because they're seeing what's happening, and they're reacting to the reporting that's out there, to the people that are in the streets, and to the citizen journalists, most importantly, that are documenting all this every day.
I want to play a few things to get into this conversation, and one of them is what you just referenced, this interview you did with a Marine Corps veteran whose father was taken, with who's a lawn care specialist, was taken off the street, the video that you were talking about. You spoke to him yesterday, or the other day, on Deadline White House. Let's play it.
You're a Marine Corps veteran, and your two brothers, Alejandro, are serving active duty in the Marines right now. The three of you all received training on use of force as Marines. When you look at the video of how those agents treated your father, do you agree with what Homeland Security said, that was a minimum use of force?
I think it's the complete opposite. I think it's the maximum amount of force, and I think unprofessional force. You see in the video where my dad is running with the weed whacker, there's a so-called agent running with his gun in hand, pointing it sideways at a vehicle. The guy's holding him down, 5'7" guy, maybe 150-pound man. It doesn't take 4 or 5 guys, 200 plus, beating him in the face, pepper spraying him within inches, not even the appropriate distance. Like, that's just unprofessional.
You served in Afghanistan. What would have happened if you would have treated a detainee that way in the Marines?
I promise you it would have been a war crime, and the situation would have been completely different.
Okay, so not that video in particular, but videos like it of people being taken off the street, again, by these masked law enforcement officers. They've been making the rounds on social media. People have had visceral reactions to them. And one of those people is Joe Rogan, who endorsed Donald Trump, who voted for Donald Trump, has a giant platform, probably one of the big reasons Donald Trump won. He had a visceral reaction as well. Let me play it.
I don't think if the Trump administration, if they're running and they said, we're going to go to Home Depot and we're going to arrest all the people at Home Depot, we're going to go to construction sites and we're going to just tackle people at constructions. I don't think anybody would have signed up for that. They said, we're going to get rid of the criminals and the gang members first, right? And now we're seeing Home Depots get raided. That's crazy.
So we talked about how this was not what anyone signed up for. But as you said, they did actually campaign on this, mass deportation now. So it raises this question. Who did the voters think these immigrants were? And did they think that the undocumented immigrants that were going to be deported were the ones that were working locally, that were a part of the community? Or did they have in their mind an idea of what an undocumented immigrant was because Donald Trump campaigned on rapists and drug dealers coming across the border, some very fine people as well, he said, or some also are good people as well during his campaign announcement.
As you know better than anybody.
And he also campaigned with angel families.
That's right.
And these were parents, loved ones of people who were killed by undocumented immigrants, either intentionally and violently, or who, got hit by a car. And they were grieving on stage. It was a very emotional scene to see them talk about their loved ones who were lost because somebody was in this country who shouldn't be there. I'm wondering, in the conversations you would have with people out there on the campaign trail, if the idea that they had of what an undocumented immigrant was that they were all violent criminals. They were all here to commit violence against American citizens, to hurt American citizens, to steal from American citizens. They were all Venezuelan gang members.
Right. No, obviously, I don't think everybody believes that. But I do think that you're absolutely right, that the Trump campaign and Donald Trump have done an extraordinary job of convincing people, of scaring people, that the stories like the one that I saw at the very beginning of the campaign in a Colorado ballroom in, I think, February of 2016, when Stephen Miller went to the Colorado caucus to represent the Trump campaign up against Ted Cruz. I think they lost, I don't think they got a single vote, if I remember correctly, when I was there. But he stood there and he screamed from the podium about undocumented killers and murderers, and he used the example of Kate Steinle, who was tragically killed by an undocumented immigrant in San Francisco, in the Bay Area.
Remind me of this immigrant, this undocumented immigrant was somebody who had been deported but then had gotten back into the country, right?
It was let's just put it this way. It was a heinous crime. A tragic, heinous crime.
The person should not have been here.
And obviously it was a murder, committed, in this case, by an undocumented immigrant. And those stories exist in this country. And the Trump world has taken those stories and I think convinced a lot of people that that's who the majority of undocumented immigrants in this country are. And so at the conventions, at these events and these speeches, when they justify family separation, when they justify mass deportation, they always lean on, we're going after criminal, illegal aliens. But define that for me. I'm not asking you to do it. What's their definition of it? And when you really push them, it's just people who have broken immigration law.
Somebody who's crossed the border illegally.
Who has entered the country in an unauthorized manner, which, by the way, it's not illegal to seek asylum. And if you want to fix the system, Congress should fix the system. But the way a lot of these people are showing up, and let's say...
I had one very senior former DHS official say to me the dirty secret is Republicans will never get on board with any sort of comprehensive immigration policy, in this person's opinion, because they love it as a campaign issue.
Yeah.
That it's a great campaign issue. And to solve it, to solve the problem of the border, to solve the problem of the interior and bringing people out of the shadows, would take away what has been a very successful campaign issue.
The last person to solve it was Ronald Reagan, when he gave amnesty to people who were in the country without authorization, who had been working for a particular amount of time and met the criteria that the administration set out. And I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying the last time there was a departure from the bipartisan, deterrence-based, punitive-based immigration policy was when you and I maybe we weren't born yet. It was in the early 1980s. And since then, Democrats and Republicans have leaned into what Donald Trump is doing the most supersized version of today, which is punishing people and hurting people in order to scare them away from coming to the country.
I wonder if it's still a good campaign issue. And I think it's a really open question because we saw child separations during the first administration, and it was horrifying, and the American public was horrified by it. Mm-hmm. And yet, Donald Trump did not win. 4 years passed. It passes. He runs again, runs on immigration again, runs on mass deportation. Why do you think the American public still voted for him, even after experiencing child separations?
Because I think that we're all human beings and we all live our own lives too. And I think it's really difficult. I'm not saying that this is what I do or what we should do, but I think a lot of people compartmentalize and think about that, like the stories that I saw during the election. My bread's expensive in Omaha. My cherry tree farm in Wisconsin, it's not like what it used to be here. I can't find, whatever. There's a million stories like that. And people have personal reasons why they decide to make those choices. But for me, what we haven't heard we heard Joe Biden say he was going to have a safe, fair, humane, orderly system. He was going to have a departure, wholesale departure from the cruelty of the Trump administration. And then we saw Joe Biden put forward some very conservative immigration policies, including, I went to Haiti. I saw them deport more people than they ever had, expulsions in a short amount of time, to a country where, in all likelihood, they probably have a relatively decent chance of dying when they go back there.
So there were policies put into place that were pretty conservative. President Obama was nicknamed the deporter-in-chief.
Yep.
But the Democrats haven't seized immigration as a campaign issue the way that the Republicans have.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if I think we can say they've done that to their detriment. They've refused to do that to their detriment. 8 million people crossed the border, something around there, during Biden's term. That's a lot of people. It's more than the Ellis Island years when the borders were essentially open. And there was a visceral reaction to that, even in cities far away from the border, cities like New York, cities like Chicago. I spoke to one woman last year in January of 2024. Her name's Kata Truss, and she sued the city of Chicago over these services they were giving to migrants that, by the way, had been bussed in or flown in from red states like Texas. Let me play what she said.
Well, one of the things that I'm frustrated about is the fact that the Biden administration is not handling the migrant crisis in a way that is good for them or the cities that the migrants are being sent to. And so what is happening here in Chicago is that we are seeing our city spend up to $48 million a month to house and take care of migrants. Now, when you talk about the Black communities here in the city of Chicago, and you talk about the years of disinvestment in our communities, in our schools, and all around us, and you see this amount of money being spent to people who have come from outside of this country, that is a problem for us. And I heard someone say earlier that here in Chicago, we're talking about turning away from the Democratic Party. I have already turned. I will be voting Republican this time around. And I don't think that that's just a sentiment of Kata Truss. I think that's the sentiment of a lot of people around the entire United States.
She wasn't wrong. I mean, if you look at the New York Times had a great map showing how the country moved in the 2024 election. And nearly every county, nearly everyone moved to the right, moved toward Donald Trump. If you went up to the Bronx, historically extremely Democratic neighborhood, they moved toward Donald Trump. And what did they say was the reason? They would talk about economics, yes, but they would also cite immigration and the concerns that Kata Truss just laid out. The Democratic Party has not offered an alternative vocally and convincingly. Is this their opportunity to do that?
I completely agree with you, and I completely understand her lived reality, and why she feels that way, and why the scenes that she was seeing play out on the streets of Chicago were overwhelming and maybe even scary to her. But I think that you're right. The Democrats, in a moment like that, didn't say, this is a country that sent a man to the moon. I mean, you name the incredible feats that the United States of America has done. We figure shit out, okay? And instead of trying to figure this out, what the Democrats have done is basically lean into the same policies of the past. We're going to punish people who try to come here to keep them away. And let me tell you something, that doesn't work. Right now, what Donald Trump would say is, well, we haven't released anybody into the interior. It's the first time ever, the first month in history that there have been no people. The fewest number of people are crossing the border in history right now. So you're wrong, Jacob. Deterrence does work. Guess what? I promise you, people will come again. The reason that more people came, I don't know the stat that you cited, but the reason that as many people came or more people came as Ellis Island is that we're living in a different world. This is a world where people are on the move constantly, millions of people, any given moment, all around the world in every hemisphere. They're fleeing climate change, they're fleeing food insecurity, they're fleeing war, they're fleeing persecution, they're fleeing violence, they're fleeing sexual assault.
Is fleeing climate change a reason for asylum?
The policymakers should make that determination. They should.
Under the current law,
no. And they should have a conversation about that. I've been to Chiquimula and Zacapa, Guatemala, where I have seen in the dry corridor nothing, no fallow fields, and people who have literally nothing, coffee plants that are not growing, people without any hope. And those areas are controlled by gangs. What would you do? Nobody wants to leave their home to go on one of the most dangerous journeys in the world through cartel-held territory, potentially be murdered, killed, raped.
No, I think you're right about
come
that.
To the United
It
States.
is a desperate situation that will force you over. But there are a lot of voters who say that should not be the problem of the United States of America.
And so, again,
and I wonder when the Democratic Party is going to take a hold of the issue and say, here's what we plan to do. We're going to limit migration at the border. I mean, Denmark has done this. The UK is talking about doing this.
I don't think anybody's saying...
Liberal Democrats are saying this, and they've been able to pass very liberal, progressive laws in the aftermath of this. They've been winning on this issue. We will be socialist, we will be liberal, but we are going to shut down the border. At the same time, ensuring that the people who do come legally, and they're not saying no one can come anymore. They're saying there'll be a legal process, and then when you get here, we've got to make sure that you integrate into the society.
So I don't think anybody, Errol Morris would say all the time, the director of Separated, the film based on my book, I don't think anybody says we shouldn't have a border. I mean, yes, there are people who say, yes, there are people who say.
Voters said Democrats said that. I mean, this is what I'm talking about.
Didn't.
I think the
They
Democrats
didn't.
have a real opportunity.
Exactly.
They didn't convincingly have it enough to make it so that they won the election.
I
mean, you could argue they had a message, but clearly the message was not convincing enough for the voters who said it was their top issue. I mean, 89% of people who said it was their top issue, immigration was their top issue, 89% voted for Donald Trump.
So many policies of the Biden administration were punitive or created humanitarian crises with the way that they treated migrants. They weren't letting, I mean, yes, a lot of people came into the country, but they were trying to stop with the same policies as other administrations. Remember the Haitians under the bridge in Del Rio, Texas? I went to Tijuana and I sat there and I went to Ukraine, as you know, to report, and then I came back. They were letting tens of thousands of Ukrainians in, but not basically black and brown people, Asians, who were sitting on the other side of the border. The border was not open to everybody at all times. It's just not, the fact of the matter is it's not true. Yes, a lot of people came in. What we weren't hearing, when all this happened, I guess, my point is, we had a retreat by Democrats back to the same policies that we've always had. And I'm not telling them what to say, but your point is a really good one. It was not some different approach. It was not,
I've always been curious about why it hasn't been more of an economic message. They talk about keeping prices down, yes, but we're in a crisis for Social Security, a tax-based crisis. We're not reproducing at the level we need in order to make sure that Social Security will be solvent for when you and I retire. If you bring in immigrants and you legalize immigrants or legalize the ones that are here, you help fight the insolvency problem. You create a tax base in a country where people are not having enough kids to replace the current population.
Great argument, great sort of point, theory. But here's the thing. Until people are treated as humans and we deal with this in a humane way, recognize the people that we're talking about are not just economic talking points or things on a bar graph, until people accept and understand that the Narciso Barrancos and Alejandro Barrancos are the ones who find themselves in the middle of this, I think we go in circles.
I think that's why this is an interesting moment, because you have Joe Rogan, who again has an incredible following, an incredible base of listeners, and people who love what he says and believe him and trust him. When you have someone like him coming out and saying this is not what people voted for, it's not what people want to see, the Democrats have an opportunity to seize the narrative on immigration.
Say something different.
Who's going to be that Democrat that goes on Joe Rogan and proposes a different way to handle immigration, proposes something that voters who went to Donald Trump can look at the Democrats and say, actually, you know what? I like their proposal on immigration. I like the way they say they're going to handle it. I think it is more humane. I think it is more fair. What Tata or Kata Truss would say, okay, I can get back on board with the Democratic Party because they say they're going to do this. They're going to, whatever the proposal is. Where is that proposal? When are we going to hear it?
And help people be less
scared. And who's it going to come from?
And help people be less scared. Because what I can say as a reporter, meeting so many people who go through these circumstances, just like any population, sure, people do things that are wrong.
And I know,
But these are-
and I know you have people in your life who are here that don't have documentation. I do. Everybody does. We all know somebody, and the idea, and knowing how scared they are right now, and knowing that at any moment you could get a call that they've been taken away. It's a heavy thought. It's a terrifying thought, and there's millions of Americans who are living through it today.
Thanks for doing
Jacob,
this.
thanks for coming on and having a long conversation about immigration with me. I appreciate it.
Anytime.
It's a worthy subject.
Thanks.
Thanks.